Hello, welcome back to another pen talk. This may be my 600th video, depends upon when I get it published, but I'm just posting my 599th video. So Pen Talk has certainly become quite a big channel, at least from the number of videos. Thanks for joining me as I explore the wide world of pens. This video is going to be a little bit of an interesting one, a little bit of a delve into vintage. We're going to take the Wayback Machine pretty far back. What we're looking at is my drawer of Wahl Eversharp fountain pens and some pencils. What is the source of this is this pen here. I bought a few years ago at a pen show. Took me a while to work on it and feel comfortable. It's now all assembled, and we'll show you some of the bits and pieces that I went through in the assembly and rejuvenation of this pen. But then I said I just can't do a review of this pen, talk a little bit about its restoration without putting it in perspective of other pens. And this is another example of a pen that we're going to explore too when we explore that nice Decoband emerald green pen. So sit back, grab a beverage, and watch. And yes, you see before you a classic Wahl fountain pen. It has the Decoband, it has the gold seal, and it's in emerald green to the best of my knowledge. The pen was made somewhere between 1927 and 1932, so it's not quite 100 years old. So I bought this pen at, I think, the last pen show I was at, which was a number of years ago. And I got the pen because the price was good, and the green celluloid is really in good shape. The pen in totality is in good shape. I tested to see that the section pulled out, and it did. I put a bladder on it. It didn't have one, but the challenge I have is how to reassemble this. So Wahl put this insert into the back of the barrel, which, as you can see, that T section slips into there, and then the lever moves up and down in pretty much a parallel situation. There's a groove here similar to what you find on Waterman's, and there's little feet on the bottom of the lever that fit into the groove. The challenge is how do you reassemble this? This needs to fit fairly securely, so pushing it in this way is going to be a challenge. So I'm going to work off camera. I have a tool that I think might work. I may have to design a tool that'll hold everything in place and allow me to slide this pressure bar into the feet of the lever while maintaining this orientation and push it all the way back to the end of the barrel. That's my intention. But I wanted to show you in pieces so you get an idea of some of the challenges in working with vintage, which I certainly enjoy. I've had this pen, as I said, for a couple years, so it's taken me a while to get to this point. There is, looks like a brass liner in the barrel, and I think that's what keeps this barrel from getting black like a lot of other ones, especially the Schaefer ones, because of gases, maybe sulfur, whatever, being emitted from the rubber sack over time darkens the celluloid. So as I mentioned, this pen is in excellent shape. I did do a little polishing and a little waxing, but that resin, that celluloid, is great. We're going to also do a little bit of a history lesson on Wahl Eversharp. They became the number 4 fountain pen maker in late 30s when they came out with their Doric model, which was their most popular. And I do have a few of those, but they will be for another video. We're going to stick with the flat top versions of their pens. So here's two examples of what I had. So this is a smaller one. No gold seal, no Decoband, but it's in working order. And the other thing I wanted to hopefully bring out is the pencil definitely has that bronze look to it, which they called bronze green. And it is definitely a different celluloid than the emerald green that's in this pen and the other pen. I wish I had more of the bronze green, but the only example I have is this pencil, which looks like it could go with the pen because of the band here. And I do keep tags on my pens to identify them when I work on them. Let's look at some more details. One of the challenges when I do a vintage pen video is I have a fair number of vintage pens, and when I start working on one, it says, oh, I think I want to look at this one, I want to look at that one. I start reading some books, and the next thing you know, days go by. But they're fun days. So this is one of my prized possessions, is this lapis lazurite, or as Wahl described it, at least in one of my books, lazuritic. It's a really pretty blue with some black specks in it. Again, the pen is in great condition. That gold insert at the top of the cap finial is interesting. But when I explored this pen a little bit further, I was confused by the nib and feed. That looks like a Skyline feed, and the nib is also not what I would expect. It says Eversharp, not even a Wahl on it. So when I was playing around with the pen, I pulled out the section because I wasn't happy with how it fit in, and the bladder is just not in good shape. Could be the original bladder. There's some red imprint on there. So I did some cleanup, put a new bladder in, and I'll reassemble this pen. It also has that metal liner in it, like we saw in the green Deco gold seal, which is the purpose of this. So you might ask, why do I think that nib is not correct? Well, here's a black version of that pen. One might call this like a military style clip because it fits deep in the pocket. If we take this one out, we'll see a nib that I would expect to see. It says Wahl Eversharp, and it's also a flexible nib. And if we turn around and look at the feed, we'll see that classic comb feed. And the other thing is yes, this is a soft nib. I have a few of these. We may get to see one of them right. So that's kind of how vintage affects me and how I get motivated, and then the next thing I know, days go by. So here's another example of the Wahl pen in what they called wood grain. They didn't want to take off on the ripple that Waterman was putting in their pens. You can see the clip here is down. It's not up at the top like it was in some of the other models. And if we take off the cap, we'll see what I consider to be an excellent example of some of the nibs that they had. This is like a very nice stub on there. And as we know from vintage, it's a little soft. It's one of my favorite nibs to use. I've got to clean this up a little bit. And I also had a tag on it. Yes, I cleaned it in 2013. It's a pen I probably had for at least 30 years or so. The other thing that we have is on the top of we'll have Made in USA. If we look at some other ones, we'll see they say Made in Chicago. The rest of the pen is clean of any type of engraving from the pen manufacturer, but it is personalized by Dorothy J. Hall. So at one time, I'm certain this was a beloved possession of Dorothy Hall. Wahl was known for their metal pens, early 20s. This is a very nice example. Interesting pattern. We'll get you the name of the pattern. The fact that it has a loop and a clip, interesting combination. I think this pen has been quite used and quite modified. It does have initials engraved there and some really interesting script. The cap comes off in just a short turn. You can see there's some threads missing. And the other thing that makes this pen a little bit of a Franken pen is that certainly is not the original nib. It works well, as one would expect with a vintage nib. But I just love that pattern. Not perfect, but it's vintage, and I like it. Here's another example. No pattern, but we'll see a patent date of 1904. We see that loop on the top. This pen has not been touched. The other thing that makes this pen unique is it's labeled as another patent date there at the bottom. It's labeled as 18 1/4. I'm assuming it's gold filled. Interesting engraving there of the owner, but nothing that says Wahl on it. I think this was a very early example. We have full threads on this one, but there's what I would say is the classic Wahl #2 nib. Beautiful long tines, and of course it flexes nicely. So this pen has not been touched since I acquired it, again, probably 30 to 40 years ago. I'm certain it'll clean up nice, and maybe if I get motivated, we'll polish it up and show it to you in its polished condition. But this is a very early version of that gold pen that Wahl became known for. And here we are with two other examples of the smaller version of the pen, one in gold filled and one in sterling. Again, these have not been cleaned up. Wahl had that very distinguished lever, which from my reading, that's what they bought the Boston Pen Company for, because they had patents on this lever design. Schaefer was suing people if they tried to use a lever design that Schaefer felt impinged on their patent. And it has Wahl pen at the top here, which they even continued on with their pens made out of plastic. A lot of wear here from posting, but again, these are vintage pens. We unscrew, we'll see a metal section on the gold pen, but we'll also see that classic Wahl #2 nib, and looks like two different sizes. And again, as we know, they're very soft nibs. This one's a lot softer than the one in a sterling pen. In fact, the sterling pen I would say is pretty stiff, but then a lot of variation. They made many different nibs for their pens. They were known for their nibs. I'd be remiss if I didn't show this pen after a slight bit of polishing and cleaning and waxing. What's nice is now that an imprint for the patent date is very clear, and that nice engraving is also very clear. You can see a little bit of the wear on that end from posting. And the same thing with the cap. I mean, this cleans up very well. And it is 18 1/8. I'm going to look that up and tell you exactly what that means. But you may say, how did I do that? Well, I use these polishing pads. I've shown these a couple times in my video. Then this pad was just used to clean this pen. It removed a lot of oxidation. So why is there oxidation on something like this that has gold? Because only 24 karat gold is 100% gold. And that's a very soft material, not something you're going to make a pen out of. So 18 karat gold is 18 out of 24% gold. So there's other metals in here, which could be copper. And when those two metals are mixed together, they don't form a very stable alloy. And over time, the copper comes to the surface and oxidizes, and that creates that oxidation. So I remove it, and then I follow up with this, which hopefully minimizes future oxidation and keeps the pen looking nice for many years. The nib and feed section pulled out very easily, so I would flush this. I'm not going to put a sack in it because this is not a pen I will use on a daily basis, but it's just a beautiful example of this type of pen from the early 1900s, 1910 to 1920 probably, because Wahl really didn't come into existence until 1917 to make fountain pens, so this is probably one from the Boston Fountain Pen Company that they bought. Here we have the blue lazulite with the new sack in it. Nice and flexible sack. I've learned that if there's a vintage sack, even if it has some flexibility to it, it's not worth, if you've taken a pen apart, replace the sack. So this is ready to talc it and reassemble it. But one of the things that I find about this pen is this is not the feed that belongs in this pen. This is a feed that came out in the 40s with the Skyline. Even though the nib appears to be appropriate, it has that heart-shaped breather hole, it does just say Eversharp. So that got me to looking at other pens. This is the focus of this video. And I was concerned because I didn't think that nib was the right nib. I thought it was too new of a nib. The feed looks right. Nice ebonite comb feed. Then I did my other green pen. The green pen has the same nib on it. So that made me believe that that nib might be appropriate for this pen. If you look at the black version, the equivalent of the blue lazulite, you'll see there's that heart-shaped breather hole, and we have Wahl Eversharp on the nib. And if we look at the oldest pen, I think, in my group is this 18 karat gold filled one, we'll just see Wahl. So I did my best research to try to find out. I can't find anybody that has done a history of all the nibs that Wahl used in all their different pens. And I have a feeling that a lot of these pens may have been made originally with one nib. They may have been made from nibs that were left over from inventory. Who knows how the pen ended up being the way it was. Because pens were meant to last a lifetime and they were expensive, a lot of people got pens fixed over and over again. So who knows, they may have brought this pen into a pen shop in the 40s. They may have broken the feed, or the feed may need to be replaced, so they replaced it with the current feed, which was the one from the Skyline. Vintage pens are both interesting, stimulating, and frustrating. I see on the vast net that a lot of people say, oh, can you tell me what year this pen was and what the model was? And a lot of times there's no simple answers, especially when they post a somewhat blurry picture and not very representative of what you need to identify a pen, markings, nibs, etc., etc. So I've mentioned and talked about how hard it is to really tie down a particular pen to a particular ear. So on removing the nib, I find something very interesting. This nib was made in England. So was it a nib that was put on because someone maybe bought the pen in the United States and took it to England, and then eventually it made it back to the United States? Could have been a pen I bought in England during my trips to London when I used to go to a lot of flea markets and street fairs looking for pens. Who knows? Something lost from my memory. But I have something here physical to remember it by. The other thing that Wahl did was they put an engraving towards the top of the cap in many of their pens. These two on the right, I would say, are the oldest ones, and they just say Made in USA. If we go over further, we'll see they've added Wahl Eversharp Made in Chicago. So they did move the facility to Chicago. And again, I feel that there wasn't consistency in when they made changes to these types of markings on the pens. You can make some approximation, but you're not going to pin it down as much as you might like. The other thing that Wahl did was they had different engravings on the clip. All these three pens have pretty much the identical clip, except the one on the far left is 14 karat gold filled. The other two say Wahl pen, but of course one has those double checks on it. This says Wahl Eversharp, Made in USA, Made in USA, Made in Chicago. So interesting how those changes have occurred. As I mentioned earlier, I think this is just using up a lot of parts when they made these pens and not really paying attention to chronological order or things, using one older part before they started the newer part. You may ask, why am I confused by nibs and feeds and things like that? So let's show you. This is that green pen that I was feeling that nib wasn't the right nib for that pen. So here's a Wahl Eversharp Skyline, a really nice example, and a lot of green. And as we look at this nib, we'll see, gee whiz, aren't they very similar? A pen from the 30s, a pen from the 40s. So that's confusing. And then when we look at this blue lapis pen, yeah, that feed certainly looks closer to the feed on the Skyline than it does to the feed on the gold seal. So a lot of strangeness going on here. But to add to the strangeness, look at this Wahl Eversharp. Nice sterling silver cover on the cap. You know, it has that interesting engraving in the back of the cap, but no lever. Strange. Take the cap off and we'll see, wow, not a nib that we've seen before. And as we flip it over, we'll see a generic injection molded plastic feed. So this is the new remake of the Skyline, and it had a captured converter. Not my favorite pen. I did buy a few of them. They were deeply discounted after they originally came out. They were somewhat expensive, and they weren't cheap even when they were discounted. But I'm glad I've added it to the original. And they did certainly get the tooling down right. Amazingly close. So no video about Wahl Eversharp would be complete without talking about the Doric, and we're not going to do a review of this pen. This is one example. I have a few of them. This is the one I really fell in love with and used as an everyday carry for a number of years. Has that personal point, really nice big point, but it's manifold. It's not flex, but then for everyday writing it works very, very well. And this green color is just phenomenal. And with the Doric, Wahl jumped into a strong number 4 position behind Parker, Waterman, and Schaefer. But that was short-lived, and the Skyline didn't really continue on. Even though it was a popular pen, the 51 was out at the time. So therefore, Wahl made one final attempt to break into the lower-end market, and this was this Symphony model. Came out in the late 40s. And as that, now we just say Eversharp on the clip. Wahl is gone. It's an unscrew cap. Threads are a little wonky. Just took a little bit of effort to get that off, a lot of thread turning. And we'll see a familiar nib one that we saw on the Skyline, and also the gold seal. But what's nice about these nibs is they're soft. And we may ink up one of these during my writing test. But this was kind of like the higher end model. They made a number of series of these. There's all numbers associated with them. I'm not going to bore you with those details. So this is another example of it. Kind of like a gold wash here with some just terrible looking. Same type of clip, same type of barrel, same type of sack lever fill. And we see the same type of nib. No, we don't. We see a different nib. And also, it is on the soft side. So even though these were their attempt to get back in, they were not successful. There's a number of these on eBay, much to my surprise, and they are fairly expensive, also much to my surprise. But that was just before Parker bought them out and then stole their design or repurposed their design and turned it into the Parker 45. Another story for another day. In addition to these two different nibs, something, again, to mystify those history buffs, we look around and we see that feed that they made popular in the Skyline, a lot of carving in it, a lot of channels. Certainly much different than the comb ebonite feeds, and these are ebonite, hard rubber. You could spend a lifetime just studying one brand and trying to get all the information you can about it. I wanted to show these two pens to show no design is exclusive. So this is a diamond pen. One of those pens that were an interesting third-party pen. You know, it has that nice ivory and black acrylic. You open it up, you'll find a warranted... you'll find a branded nib, which is really nice. And as with most vintages, a fairly soft nib. Classic vintage section, but certainly flat top, black finials, interesting. And here we have a pen from England. Not well made, parts don't fit together well. Plating's pretty wonky. And it just says made in England. If we take off the cap, we'll see the only distinguishing feature is it's a Stevens nib. Have not been able to find out much about them. If you know anything about them, let me know in the comments. But as we know, classic design, and many pen makers put pens in that design. So I mentioned how I enjoy collecting books and reading books, and here are 3 books that are dedicated to Eversharp. And I couldn't answer a lot of the questions that I had, considering the markings on the nibs, how they put Wahl and Wahl Eversharp on the clips. So as much as I enjoy these books, they still left a lot of unanswered questions. This ink is going into the emerald green Eversharp that I just restored and put a new sack in and fixed that pressure bar as much as I could. See how that works in that pen. So this ink called out to me to go into the Eversharp blue lapis pen that I just put a new bladder in. Obviously I'm not going to fill from this bottle, so I dumped it into this beaker. I got about 25 milliliters. I just wanted a very nice intense blue. We'll see if we get any shading out of it, but I think I'll be happy with how it works in the nib. So the trouble with using any type of device to transfer ink from one place to another is there's always going to be some that doesn't make it. Yeah, a few, maybe a tenth of a milliliter there that's stuck, clung to the glass. But need to do something, and with a bladder pen, a syringe is not going to do the trick. I finally got my new Fabriano notepads that I use for showing my writing examples when I do my pen reviews. I just really like this paper. It has the right amount of texture, right amount of coating, and to me I think it's good to have consistency in doing my writing examples. I may not be consistent about the ink, but I will be consistent about the paper. So for writing, we're going to start with the pen that started me on this video journey, which has lasted quite a bit, but hopefully provided you with some interesting information, some history. So one of the weird quirks and features of this pen is that little hole drilled in the gold seal. Not exactly certain why that's there. My wild theory is that someone drilled that out to test the content of that metal. The other thing you'll notice is that the lever doesn't fit flush, and that's because when I reassembled it, I didn't get the lever exactly back in the way that I wanted it. But I'm still very happy with this pen. The cap unscrews with about 1.5 turns, which I think is just what it should be for this pen. It's light, will give you the weights. I think that section's very comfortable for me. You don't feel those threads, so you can move all around. It does post very well, and it's a fairly light cap. We'll give you the weights of everything. We'll give you the dimensions of that section. And we'll give you the overall length, so it'll put this in perspective. So, as usual, over the camera, I'm not going to write with it posted, but let's see how that nib puts down that Rawhern Klinger Alt Gold Grung ink. So I'm very pleased with how this nib and ink combo work together. I've used this pen quite a bit since I first inked it up, and it took a while for that nib to adjust to me and for me to adjust to the nib, but now I really like it. And that's almost a perfect size for me. Very comfortable to write with. Very enjoyable. And that's what I like. I like to be impressed. I like to have a project like this come to fruition and have a great writing instrument to add to my collection. Let's take a look at some other nibs. So this is a smaller version of that Decoband model. You notice the lever stays flush, which is the way it should. The lever and pressure bar here work the way that they should. We have an intact gold seal at double check, and we have Wahl Eversharp. When I reassembled this after taking it all apart, I felt maybe that nib had pushed in too far, but it felt like it was the right place to be, so I said, let me see how it writes. So let's do that. Before, let's talk about the size of this pen. This is on the small side for me. It's not comfortable to write with. We'll give you the dimensions of the section. We'll give you weights. This may be a pen that I would write with more often posted. Feels a little bit better in the hand, but it's still, it bat weights the pen. It doesn't add weight down by the nib, which is where I like it. We'll give you those lengths just to put it in perspective. But where the Green Emerald Decoband was the perfect size for me, this one's a little bit on the small side. But let's see how the nib writes. I think you and I are both amazed at how well this nib writes. But I have a number of English stub nibs, primarily from the 50s, in Watermans and Parkers that I also love. I mean, this has a nice softness to it. Lays down like a medium line on the horizontal without any pressure. That's the vertical, but you put a little bit of pressure on it and it just opens up beautifully. To me, that's what you want in a flex nib. You don't want to have to put pressure on it. Soda Pop Blue looks great in here. It's not going to give you the shading like you kind of get with Gold Run, but it's still a great combo. And I like it. Again, a pen that I'm very impressed with the nib, but just the size is a little bit small for me. I think we need to finish up with that flexible nib in the black pen. This is not as soft as the English nib. Requires more pressure to get that line variation, but it certainly has a much finer line, fine to extra fine, with no pressure on the horizontals. The verticals with no pressure are just a little bit wider, but then you just put a little pressure on it and it opens right up. And as you would imagine, it's wet. And this is Pilot Blue Black. I just decided to put a generic ink in here. Again, a beautiful nib. So there's three completely different nibs by Wahl Eversharp and three similar pens. But again, every pen is unique, especially in the vintage world. They may have been somewhat mass-produced, but there was still a lot of handwork. And because they could be close to 100 years old, they've probably gone through a lot of changes during their life. And you're seeing that final product that you're using now in 2021. Hope you've enjoyed this long exploration of Wahl Eversharp pens based on one that I bought in a pen show and now eventually restored it to writing order. So I'd like to thank you for watching. I really enjoy all of my viewers and their comments and their interactions. It makes this fun and makes me feel that the time and effort that I put into these videos actually is enjoyed by many. So I hope you are all safe, healthy, and happy, and finding pens that you love to write with, putting ink on paper, because that's what it's all about. We've reached the end of this video. We're going to say bye. Welcome to 2021. More videos to come.